I have to admit, I haven't done nearly as much of as I would like to, but boy, does it feel good to say it. And that is, congratulations, Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party room. I'm reliably told by individuals who are there that the atmosphere in the party room when the debate occurred to say no to the voice was both civilised and extremely positive. Various MPs got up to speak, the issues were poured over from different angles, there was no acrimony. As I understand it, the clinching argument revolved around the issue of inequality of citizenship. This notion was put forward brilliantly and articulately by barrister Louise Clegg in this week's Spectator Australia, where Louise writes, quote, "It is beyond a shadow of a doubt that if the voice speaks regularly, powerfully and politically, and as its adherents all say it will and must, then Indigenous people on whose behalf it purportedly speaks will lose moral force or authority. This will be the price of inserting inequality of citizenship into the Constitution." Louise goes on, quote, "It is inconceivable that the voice can exert the political power in Canberra that its adherents desire and at the same time occupy a place of high moral authority." Quote, "An Indigenous voice might feel like the right thing to do in the abstract world of progressive academics and amongst the knowledge classes, but it will almost certainly be terrible for Indigenous people." Over the weekend, it has become apparent that the Liberal Party has been energised by this firm and unequivocal no to the voice. Certainly, and I can promise you this, the base has been energised. And no, I don't mean Paul McCartney or Bill Wyman. I mean that dreadful term, the Liberal Party base, which basically means you, me and every other Australian with half an ounce of common sense. Who knows, maybe the Libs needed to lose the Aston by-election in order to find their spine. Indeed, as I wrote in my editorial in the Spectator Australia this week, quote, "The Liberals have now reached the point where they realise that chasing wokeness is a one-way path to oblivion. Better to fight." And this is the point. The woke experiment has been an unmitigated disaster for the Liberal Party. Election loss after election loss. Hopefully, Peter Dutton and his team now realise this and will focus all their energies in fighting Labor tooth and nail, because the reality is we are now, every day to whenever the referendum is held, probably around October 15th, we are now fighting for the future of Australia. Make no mistake, the stakes could not be higher. Whoever wins this referendum, and it's now a choice between the yes vote, in which you show support for Labor and the Greens, or a no vote, in which you show support for the Liberals, the Nationals, One Nation and so on. Whoever wins this referendum will form the next federal government within 2 years' time. If the yes case wins in the referendum, Albanese will ride on its coattails into a quick election and will almost certainly win it. And Peter Dutton will be finished. But if the no vote wins this referendum, Albanese is dead in the water. The unions and his own party will tear him to shreds. Outsiders fans may remember I urged the mums of Australia to sacrifice their Mother's Day back in 2019 to have the conversation with the kids, the woke kids and grandkids at lunch, and explain to them the reasons to oppose the left. This time I'm saying sacrifice your Easter lunch and don't shy away from having the discussion with your family members and explaining as dispassionately as possible why the voice is wrong, how plenty of Indigenous Australians don't want it and indeed see it as yet another massive distraction and a gargantuan waste of money that should be being spent directly in the remote communities, not in Canberra's marble-plated palaces pampering overpaid public servants. As always, of course, the best unintentional laughs have come from The Guardian newspaper, in which we read, quote, "That regardless of the success or otherwise of the referendum, Peter Dutton is now locked in as a Tony Abbott-style opposition leader, a hard man." Sorry, that's a criticism, Guardian. That's precisely what we've all been waiting for. Another Tony Abbott-style opposition leader for the Libs. And you know why? Because they win. Unlike the Matt Guys and the Dave Sharmas and the Trent Zimmermans and the Zach Kirkups and who was that guy in South Australia? I can't even remember his name now. Unlike those Liberals, Tony Abbott-style hard men, such a rarity until this week, have one thing in common. They win. Of course, along with the lovies at The Guardian, the mob over at the Sydney Morning Herald were just as quick to jump on their high horse, but again, they got it the wrong way round. The voice will crack the libs. Wyatt proves it, they said. Oh dear. So this is the idea that because some character who is not even in Parliament has resigned from the Liberal Party will now split in two, like the San Andreas Fault in a Superman movie. No, afraid not, guys. Firstly, for those who don't remember, which is probably most of us, Ken Wyatt, the bloke who has resigned, is famous for two things. Firstly, he was the first Indigenous member of the lower house, and for that he rightly deserves his place in the history books. But I'm afraid Mr. Wyatt did himself no favours when he opted to back Malcolm Turnbull in the coup against Tony Abbott, the hard man, back in 2015. And indeed, Ken Wyatt joins in a very long line of bedwetting Liberals who did far more harm to Indigenous Australians and remote communities than good when they tore down Tony Abbott. Compare the Prime Ministers. Let's compare Abbott and Albo. Let's not forget Tony Abbott genuinely cared about Indigenous Australian communities, taking the entire cabinet to live and work in outback Aboriginal communities for up to a week at a time when he was Prime Minister. Mr Albanese can barely spend a few hours in Alice Springs before he has to rush off to a far more important rendezvous with a chocolate magnum with his missus courtside at Rod Laver Arena. Compare the pair. But I digress. Ken Wyatt was one of the gang of treacherous MPs who backed Malcolm Turnbull's coup, possibly in exchange for a ministry portfolio, but who knows? But what we do know is it was downhill for the Libs from there on in. Bizarrely, some strange shenanigans took place in those first few days of the Turnbull ministry when, oh, hello, a strange leak took place. According to the Courier Mail, and I quote, "Secret laws drafted by new Minister Ken Wyatt will create a powerful, taxpayer-funded Indigenous commission that reviews government policies, activates task forces, probes complaints and informs itself on any matter in any way it thinks fit." Words fail me. The fix was in way back then. So Ken Wyatt, who failed to get re-elected at the last election, presumably his constituency tired of his leftist activism, has resigned from the Liberal Party. And this is supposed to be the Liberal Party cracking apart. I don't think so. This is the Liberal Party doing what a decent opposition does: oppose. Speaking of those who've succeeded in cracking the Liberal Party apart, only this week, straight after the Aston by-election loss, who should pop up like a malevolent jack-in-the-box? Why, Malcolm Bligh Turnbull, warning us all that the Liberal Party is now facing electoral catastrophe. Of course. Funny how the man who did so much damage to the Liberal Party is now so concerned for its welfare. But hang on. I thought Malcolm wasn't going to intervene in partisan politics. At least that's what he told legendary BBC broadcaster Andrew Neil.
Will you return to politics at some stage?
I certainly won't. I'm always interested in politics, but I won't be engaging in the partisan political battle. So, you know, I'm a Liberal, no question about that. But I'm not going to be, you know, I've retired from politics. I'm out of partisan politics.
Right, yes, OK, Malcolm. But that reminded me, we all know Turnbull would have got hammered had he remained Prime Minister, and ScoMo only narrowly managed to pull off the miracle election. Remember the miracle election? That was thanks to you, the outsiders, among many others. But for reasons that shall become very clear in a second, I was reminded only the other day about this astonishing piece of self-delusion by Malcolm Turnbull in that very same interview on the BBC with Andrew Neil.
I was certainly voted out by my party room, fairly narrowly, But I think that said more about the internal politics of the Liberal Party than of the electorate. I mean, at the time...
Well, they didn't like Eurocentrism.
At the time of the coup in August, we were level pegging on the public polls with the opposition, and we were 4 points ahead on the polling in the marginal seats. But basically, you could argue that their concern was not that I would lose the election, but rather that I would win it.
You're telling me your own party didn't want you to win the next election?
Well, I'm just saying, if you analyse...
That's not credible, is it?
Well, Andrew, you've only got to look at the facts.
Fantastic, so good. Andrew Neil is, of course, Britain's greatest television interviewer, and it just shows you how arrogant and delusional Turnbull was to think he could pull the wool over Andrew Neil's eyes. There's also a reminder of just how delusional the Liberal Party bedwetters are, the Braggs and the Birminghams, and just how disastrous their experiment with going woke and pandering to the left has been. Peter Dutton now has the chance to galvanise common-sense conservatives and equality-loving, anti-racist, anti-elitist, fair dinkum Aussies across the nation behind the no vote. If he succeeds, he'll be in the lodge within 2 years, and Australia's descent into New Zealand-style wacko socialism and woke tyranny can be hit with a handbrake U-turn. I mentioned Andrew Neil. Long-term Outsiders fans will, of course, know that Andrew has been on this show before in this studio, and that he's the owner. Apart from being the greatest interviewer in the English language on TV, he is also the owner of the oldest political and cultural magazine in the world, which I happen to have here, The Spectator, and he is my boss at The Spectator Australia. Many of you will remember that it was thanks to Andrew Neil's persistent line of questioning that the former Extinction Rebellion activist Zion Lights changed her climate doom-mongering and instead has become a fervent proponent of nuclear energy as the only way to reach net zero. Here's just a snippet of that extraordinary exchange.
And people are feeling really, desperate that we're heard on this. And unfortunately, alarmist language works, which is why we're discussing it right now.
But does it work? It could. I mean, I've seen young girls on television, part of your demonstration, particularly the school ones, when they take the day off to demonstrate, crying because they think they're going to die in 5 or 6 years' time.
No, it's not necessarily...
Crying because they don't think they'll ever see adulthood. And yet there is no scientific basis for the claims that your organisation is making.